I'm speaking with economic historian and author Webster Tarpley. Today's show, Austerity Psychosis Grips Washington, D.C. I'm Bonnie Faulkner. This is Guns and Butter. Well, now, this 2011 budget resolution, this was negotiated by congressional Republicans and the White House. Now, right. What about the Democrats? Didn't 108 Democrats vote no?
Yeah. Let's look at this. Now, this was Pelosi and the rest of them, as I indicated at the beginning. I would say at this point, if this were a parliamentary government, Obama would have fallen. In other words, this is really the fall of the Obama government if he had been the prime minister, because under that system, he would be essentially out of office. The roll call vote on this is, I think, highly instructive because it's a moment of inflection. A majority of House Democrats, a large majority of House Democrats voted against Obama on this. The final vote is 260 for it and 167 against it. So 59 Republicans vote no. That's the hardcore Tea Party fanatic lunatic fringe. But you see, it's substantial. It's 59-60 representatives. 81 Democrats vote yes. So they sell out. These would be your blue dogs, your moderates, or those faithful to Obama. And the really interesting number is 108 Democrats vote no to Obama's proposed budget. 108. Now, in a vote of confidence, he would lose the vote of confidence. He'd be out. So we could say Obama is now governing with a Republican majority. In other words, he's now straddling the Republican, what can we say, the less insane Republicans, I guess. In other words, not the Tea Party, but the rest, and the Blue Dog Democrats. And that's now Hope and Change. Hope and Change is governing with a Republican majority. It's also interesting that without the Democrats, this could have been voted down. At a key point, Congressman Boehner, right, the Speaker of the House, turns to Steny Hoyer of Maryland and says, Steny, I need 80 votes. And Steny Hoyer delivers 80 votes. So this was passed with Democratic votes. Very important because if you're talking about fighting austerity, which was what any sensible person would want to do, you'd have to say, well, the Democrats are hopelessly compromised because almost half of them voted for it, although, again, 81 for it, 108 against it. So it is a disaster.
In January of 2009, then-President-elect Obama told the Washington Post about cuts that needed to be made. Let's listen to the clip.
The real problem with our long-term deficit actually has to do with our entitlement obligations and the fact that historically, if our revenues ranged between 18 and 20% of GDP, they're now at 16. It's just not sustainable. So we're going to have to craft what George Stephanopoulos called a grand bargain, and I try not to use the word grand in anything that I say, but we're going to have to shape a bargain. This, by the way, is where there are going to be some very difficult choices, and issues of sacrifice and responsibility and duty are going to come in because what we have done is kick this can down the road. We're now at the end of the road, and we are not in a position to kick it any further.
What's your comment on what you just heard?
Well, I included an extensive discussion of that in my book, Surviving the Cataclysm, Your Guide to the Worst Financial Crisis in Human History, because what this shows is that Obama is an austerity machine pre-programmed by his handlers, by Wall Street, by Geithner, by Bernanke, by Summers, by Rubin, and Volcker, and the rest of these people. Notice he never talked about gouging Social Security and gouging Medicare, or very, very seldom in his election campaign. I mean, you could see that he was a Malthusian. You could see that he was an austerity Democrat, a Wall Street Democrat. That was all obvious. But out of all the verbiage in that campaign, it never got around to the idea that we've got to have really draconian austerity. I would say genocidal austerity. There is no other term. Try to explain why in a minute. Against these entitlement programs. He has not been forced to do these things. He has been forced to do them under conditions which maybe he didn't quite predict, but this is what he was programmed to do from the beginning. The Daily Beast has an unnamed, high-level Democratic official posing the obvious problem: how do we get rid of this guy? He's a disaster. Take a look at the article recently in the Daily Beast about this, and I think that is a fairly common view among a significant part of the Democrats on the Hill.
Well, how about the rise in oil prices? What is the main cause of the price escalation?
Good question. This past week, the three networks, the three broadcast networks and PBS have all, in their own ways, tried to explain why the gasoline price is going up. And even Obama, in an interview with Stephanopoulos, has conceded that even Obama knows that this is the number one issue for many people, because now it's about, in many areas it's $4, but in places like Southern California it's almost $5 and so on. You'll remember that in August to September 2008, on the eve of the panic in Wall Street, the derivatives bust of that year, you had oil reach $150 a barrel. And then it came down to about $35 a barrel. And at the time, it was very clear what this was. It was not supply. It was not demand. It was speculation. Speculation by Goldman Sachs and Morgan Stanley in particular, using index futures on the London ICE, Intercontinental Exchange, in a deregulated environment, even worse than the U.S., is what the British have. And I estimated that at the peak of the crisis, if you were paying $5 a gallon for gas, you were paying 50 cents to Goldman Sachs and 50 cents to Morgan Stanley out of every gallon you bought. So that was a direct subsidy by you to these hedge fund hyenas, or zombie bankers, as the case may be. And I think that's what you have again now. You notice that when the panic came, all of these positions were liquidated. In other words, it came down, almost a free fall. And the reason for that is that they had to sell all of these holdings. All those positions had to be liquidated to get cash for zombie banks that needed immediate cash to avoid bankruptcy. So that's what they did. They started selling the futures that they had been buying long and trying to bid up. They began selling. They began dumping them. So that's why it went down. I don't know what better proof you would have of the role of speculation than the fact that it went from 150 to 35 within a couple of months with no real change in the world economy. Well, there was some contraction, but not enough to explain that. So now what do we have? What you have now on these programs, right? Every network, they get an expert and they say, well, there are two things. One is supply. The Middle East is in ferment. Libya is cut off. Libya is about, 2% of the world market, but it's very high-quality specialty oil. So supply is less. Demand is greater because the Chinese are now pushing consumer goods to avoid a color revolution. They want to have consumer goods development, so there's more gasoline needed for China. Now, they're true up to a point, but they're also irrelevant because the main thing that's going on, everybody knows, is Morgan Stanley and Goldman Sachs are up to their old tricks once again on the London ICE exchange. It is pure speculation using, to be sure, these two arguments, right, using the Libyan argument and the Chinese argument as a means to hype a speculative bubble in the oil market. And that's what they're doing. Now, you want to stop them. Here's what you'd need to do. The one thing I've already said, the Wall Street sales tax is indeed a 1% tax on all derivatives. That means every index future contract that is bought and sold on any barrel of oil that's eventually going to reach the United States, because that's the way the law is framed. So it can be London ICE. You're going to have to pay this anyway because you're talking about a barrel that's going to reach the U.S. It's therefore subjected to the U.S. regulatory regime. You have to, work to enforce that. We'll pay a 1% tax. Every index future contract on oil reaching the United States, anytime that contract is bought and sold, that's a 1% tax into the federal treasury. So with that, you've already done something to take the life out of the booze for these speculators. The second thing you want to do is to impose 100% margin requirements, saying if you want to buy a future barrel of oil, you've got to come up with 100% of the cash at the beginning. You can also do things like saying you can only buy and sell a derivative if you own it. In other words, if you want to buy some kind of a derivative to hedge, you can only do that if you actually own the oil. And that brings us to the other question. The distinction between a hedger, meaning an end user, and a speculator. The hedger is somebody who says, I use oil in my production process, and I have to insulate myself against possible ups and downs in the price during the time I'm manufacturing the oil, therefore I use derivatives. Okay, you're going to pay 1%, and you can do that as long as you're an end user. In order to be a hedger, you're an end user. You're actually going to take delivery of the crude oil. If you come in as a speculator, then a whole different regime of rules apply to you, and they're going to be against you. In other words, not to encourage speculation, but to discourage it. And position limits, that nobody is allowed to come in and try to corner the market or get anywhere near cornering the market. In other words, you can't have a relatively restricted market like this and have Citibank or J.P. Morgan Chase come in and say, guess what, we're going to buy half of the world's production for next week. No, you can't. There's a position limit that limits you to, 5% of the market. So in other words, re-regulation, typical New Deal stuff, all tried and true, nothing uncertain about it, worked before, would work again. All you need is the political will. And I guess at this point you have to wonder, will the Democratic Party ever do that? I'm very skeptical. I think, there is some chance that the Democratic Party might still be alive, but I think from many points of view it's a moribund institution. So the question is now, what are you going to do about that, since the Democratic Party is just not there anymore? You've certainly got to constitute a very aggressive pressure group sort of on the left edge of the Democratic Party demanding this kind of reform.
I'm speaking with economic historian and author Webster Tarpley. Today's show, Austerity Psychosis Grips Washington, D.C. I'm Bonnie Faulkner. This is Guns and Butter. What do you think about PIMCO, the largest bond fund, dumping U.S. treasuries?
Well, this shows the mentality of these neo-feudal finance oligarchs, right? This is Bill Gross, who says he is not buying treasuries anymore. It's the bond, he's the bond king. So he's a bond salesman. That's great. He's a bond salesman who has made out like a bandit in this deregulated market. And now he says he's actually shorting treasuries. Again, I would say you should pay 1%. He's probably using derivatives to do that. And if he's using any kind of derivatives, like options or futures, then he should be paying 1%. And maybe that would make him see the light that this is not a good thing to do. Once you get out of the strictly economic realm, you can say, well, that's something like high treason, that's sociopathic behavior. This is exactly the kind of stuff that we should find ways to suppress through appropriate legislation.
Webster, is there anything you'd like to add?
Here's the some things that people should bear in mind. In the course of this debate, we hear again and again that the United States is a center-right nation, and it is not. This is a New Deal nation, and the findings are extraordinary and surprised even me, because in spite of the Koch propaganda, in spite of the Austrian school, in spite of Milton Friedman and the Chicago Boys, and all the years and decades of absolutely stultifying propaganda, the United States has an overwhelming consensus in favor of the New Deal. And the opposition to that comes down to a lunatic fringe of about 20%.